When it comes to planting up a whole variety of different orchids from different species, the choice of potting media becomes daunting. But let me go through what I use for some of the different ones and explain to you why I do it. And these are all grown outdoors, so we'll get into it for the outdoor growing of these orchids and what media is going to suit them best. Your climatic conditions might be slightly different, so I'll just give you the reasoning behind why I do it the way I do, and that will help you come to your own conclusions as to what media to use that's going to suit your environment better. And welcome to the Nature Company. If this is the kind of information you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't already, and that notification bell to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. And today I'll go through some of the basic media choices for Cattleya, Dendrobium, Oncidiums, and Phalaenopsis, just to give you a rough idea of how I go about it. So let's start off with the Cattleyas. So all of these Cattleyas I'm growing outdoors, and I'm using a different media in just about every one of them, but we'll explain to you why. This Cattleya we've got in a tallish pot, and we're using a fine bark to grow it in. At the base of this pot I've got polystyrene. This is to help with the drainage. So I've got about 1/3 polystyrene at the bottom and then this fine bark on top. This is just to hold a little bit of moisture, because this isn't necessarily what's going to be getting full rain all the time. It's a little bit undercover of a tree, so it's not getting the dew either. So I need to keep the moisture in the pot to help that grow well. This Cattleya, we can see I've used of the fine river stone or grit and these concrete stone or building stone, the 19mm. And I've added in perlite, because this drains incredibly quickly, and on a hot day it's just going to dry out. So I just wanted to add that extra little bit of moisture retention in a purely inorganic mix. Cattleyas have these rather thick roots, and they need lots of air movement around them. They don't want to be stagnant in water, otherwise they just tend to rot. Cattleyas are inclined to be relatively drought hardy, so we want to give them a mix that's going to basically mimic what they have in nature, so we're not constantly fighting to keep them alive. And here we can notice the different sizes of the pots that I've used Cattleyas and the different medias that I've used in each one. The shorter pot with all these air aeration for good drainage and air movement, but I added the perlite to compensate. In the taller pot I've put 1/3 styrofoam in these big chunks for that extra air movement. This is not going to hold any moisture, it's not going to hold any nutrient, it's just going to allow for the air to dry out the excess water and for that water to move through freely. And then I've used this orchid bark in these chunks to fill up the balance, to allow for the roots to be able to root through it and receive moisture. With the large Cattleya in a large pot, I've used large pieces of charcoal with medium-sized bark chips. This is to ensure that it's got good drainage, especially in such a large pot like this. We don't want any buildup of moisture in the pot that's going to rot the roots. It's going to be well drained. The charcoal is going to help clean the water and allow for those air spaces to stay constant in amongst the bark mix. And when dealing with your Cattleyas, as opposed to using grit and building stone, you can just as well use lacquer in the different forms. You can mix them together or use them separately, and depending on your watering regime you can add that extra perlite in to ensure that they holds that little bit of extra moisture for longer. Cattleyas in particular grow well in that sort of mix. And then I'll go through the hanging baskets separately, so let's just stick with that for now. And when it comes to Dendrobiums, we're looking at a fairly similar technique as what we do with the Cattleyas, because also their roots are susceptible to rot and they like that really good drainage and those periods of drying out. But there's a few extra little things that we must take into cognizance when dealing with Dendrobiums. And often when we look at our Dendrobiums, we notice the pots and the containers they're in seem to be incredibly small for the size of plant that it is. Well, they tend to like to be contained a little bit, tend to almost enjoy being squished into a tiny little container, and they seem to thrive better like this. And then when I'm potting up my Dendrobiums, especially if I'm using pots, I use a fine orchid bark, especially for the smaller ones. But what I do is I half fill my pots with this 19mm building stone. And that only leaves me with a small layer of bark at the top. This way, the Dendrobium can get the moisture from the bark, but it still allows the bark to dry out really quickly, especially since the heat is coming from the top and the sides. The bark can dry out and evaporate, and then it's got all that heavy stone at the bottom, so that when I put my pots down, they don't fall over. So even with these large expanded plants like this in a tiny little pot, there's a hefty weight to the pot and it's not going to fall over. We've got half stone and half bark. Dendrobiums are incredibly hardy, drought resistant plants and are terribly susceptible to root rot. So giving it away for the media that it's in to dry out quickly is your best bet. Also with Dendrobiums, you can use things like your charcoal and your medium-sized bark mixed together. You can even add in just small amounts of your coir chunks just to hold the moisture, but not so that it's being kept at the roots. I don't use the lacquer because the lacquer is extremely light and it doesn't give the weight to the base of the plant that I need. Also, the styrofoam is way too light. And when it comes to the Oncidiums and the Oncidium family, the Brassias, Oncidiums, things like that, we look at them slightly differently. These are more moisture-loving plants. They want to keep some of that moisture around their roots, and you want to keep their pseudobulbs plump all the time. So they treat it slightly differently when it comes to what media we choose. And then the Oncidiums, we can see we've also got this in a basic bark media. I'll fill this whole pot up with bark and we'll just use this fine orchid bark. Not the super fine. This one just provides a nice environment, allows the roots to go through and hold enough moisture. Often we'll add some of this chopped coir in. This also holds that extra moisture so that once all the water's run out through the bark, we've got these little moisture soaks, little sponges that have got holding that extra moisture but not blocking the air gaps. And also, if you want to add a little bit of extra weight, I would add maybe 1/4 of the bottom of the pot. We can add some of this stone in to allow for the drainage and just to give that little bit of extra weight at the bottom, especially when your plants start to get big. And here in this larger specimen plant, we can see our bark chunks are slightly larger. We've got it in an air pot, which allows that air movement through into the middle of the pot, and that just allows us to have a larger volume of media in the pot without rotting the orchid. With the Oncidiums, you can add small amounts of your charcoal if you want, just to increase the air gaps in between. But as you start adding more non-absorbent materials, so you'll need to add in extra absorbent materials to counteract, just to ensure that you do have enough moisture kept in the media to suit your Oncidiums. And now with Phalaenopsis. Just looking in carefully there, you can see that we've used our coir chunks and some superfine bark. Often I'll just use the coir chunks by themselves. This makes an excellent media for them. It's long lasting. It decomposes very slowly compared to the bark. So you'll have a longer lifespan with using just your coir. And it holds enough moisture. It's light. It allows for air movement. And it's a lot more manageable than using something like sphagnum moss, which can start complicating things. Then you're going to have to be super wary of how much water you're feeding to your plant. Otherwise, you're going to rot the whole thing out really quickly. So I find coir is probably the easiest, most manageable media for me to plant my Phalaenopsis into. As soon as you start using other medias, you start having to add in moisture retention items such as your perlite. So you can be using things like your charcoal and your lacquer, even your stones. But remember, you're going to have to start adding moisture retentive items just to help hold that extra moisture, or you're going to have to be watering almost every day. Especially if humidity levels are low, then things like your stones, your lacquer and your charcoal are just going to dry way too quickly for your Phalaenopsis to be able to keep up with moisture absorption. And now we'll have a basic look at the different methods I use for the hanging baskets. I don't poke my eyes out doing it. So let's have a look at this Cattleya, for instance. Here I've used absolutely no liner whatsoever. I've just used these large decorative bark chunks so that they don't fall out through the large gaps in the hanging basket. And then the center of that, I've used an orchid bark mix. So the large bark chunks, all it's doing is allowing the fine bark to be sitting in there without falling directly through. Now we can see how the Cattleya has grown its roots all around the outside. This is perfect for it so that they can dry out quickly, they can absorb the moisture when it's given, and then they can dry out without causing any rot or damage to the plant. Our Dendrobium again is in a way smaller basket than what the plant is. We notice again how thin the basket is. It's a very low, short basket. And this is to allow for that rapid drying out of the media. I've used an orchid bark as the media for in here, and it's just purely bark that has now been overgrown with roots all the way through to the base, and it's become almost a solid mass of just roots. And then the Oncidium. Notice I've used a plastic pot that's going to hold the moisture in the media for longer. Here again, I've used exactly the same bark that I've used in the other two, but in a pot like this, where it's only got the drain holes for the water to run out, it's going to stop evaporation through the sides, and it's going to hold the moisture in here for a lot longer. So this keeps that moisture levels and the humidity around the plant that this is a brassia, that the brassia is going to prefer to keep those pseudobulbs plump. So I hope this has given you a fair idea about how I go about potting up my different species of orchids, and I hope it makes your decisions on what media to use easier. As I said, these are all grown outdoors and mostly exposed to the elements as they are. So thank you for watching. And if you found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't already, and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.